Good afternoon, folks. Today is Thursday. August 27th. It's the Feast of St. Monica, whom we know as the mother of St. Augustine. Tomorrow is the Feast of St. Augustine, um, the son of St. Monica. One of his claims to fame. Monica is, in popular understanding, she was the one who kind of prayed Augustine through his conversion. That is to say, she wanted him to convert, to leave his sordid lifestyle, to convert to Catholicism. And so eventually he goes on to become whom we know as St. Augustine, the bishop of Hippo. I'm not sure I don't think there's a term for a priest mother, like a stage mother of an actor. But Monica is revered for seeing her sons, seeing Augustine particularly, through and into a holy life, patience, prayer. She's also the patron saint of anyone who's dealing with a difficult chronic situation, patron saint of addicts, just to constantly in the midst of struggle, in the midst of hopelessness, in the midst of, are we ever going to get through this, praying through it to better life, I want to just read, I want to get to the Gospel of the day, but I want to read something about, which Augustine wrote about his mother, the account of her death. One day during her illness, she lapsed into unconsciousness and for a short time was unaware of her surroundings. We all came running, but she quickly returned to her senses, and gazing at me and my brother as we stood there, she asked in puzzlement, "Where was I?" We were bewildered with grief, but she looked keenly at us and said, "You are to bury your mother here." I was silent, holding back my tears, but my brother said something about his hope that she would not die far from home, but in her own country, for that would be a happier way. On hearing this, she looked anxious, and her eyes rebuked him for thinking so. Then she turned her gaze from him to me and said, "What silly talk." Not long afterward, addressing us both, she said, "Lay this body anywhere and take no trouble over it. One thing only do I ask of you, that you remember me at the altar of the Lord, wherever you may be." Having made her meaning clear to us with such words as she could muster, she fell silent and travailed as the disease grew worse. Remember me at the altar, wherever you may be. That somehow we are all caught up in this great prayer of praise. It also reminds me too, that more than, finding my own mother at her grave in Gethsemane Cemetery, to be, very honest, I find my visits there really empty. Because I sense my mother's presence or her spirit in so many other places so much more readily. Especially if not especially like the Eucharist, in food. All those things she made, which only she could make, or tasted, just had her taste. She made, and my mother was Polish, as you may know, but she made this great chow mein, just like loaded with beef and chicken and all sorts of good stuff. Not to be replicated as much as, well, certainly I with my limited culinary skills, but I have two cousins, Kathleen and Christine, who are great cooks, excellent cooks, but can't quite replicate Aunt Mary's chow mein, or whether it's potato soup or potato pancakes or whatever it might be. Speaking of mother of the priest, too, my mother, although St. Monica is in one class, my mother was in quite another. I recall one event. This was at St. Philip's Church, my home parish, which my parents belonged to my mother belonged to until she died, baptized there and died there. But I was at some event, a fall festival or something, and I was with my mom, and someone came up and said, "Oh, you must be so proud to have a son who's a priest, and such a blessing, and such a gift, and such a grace, and such a whatever. This just must be, heaven." And my mother was rather sarcastic and didn't say anything to the woman other than she smiled politely. But when the woman left, my mother and I had a great laugh, because my mother, of course, knew me and knows what it means to be my mother, and that it wasn't always, even then wasn't all a blessing and a grace and the cat's meow. So there's some mothers of priests like St. Monica who are over the moon. There are other mothers like my own who are more, who have their feet on the ground. Let's look at today's gospel. Jesus' journey, this is from the Gospel of St. Luke. Jesus journeyed to a city called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd accompanied him. As he drew near to the gate of the city, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. A large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he was moved with pity for her and said to her, "Do not weep." He stepped forward and touched the coffin. At this the bearers halted, and he said, "Young man, I tell you, arise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, exclaiming, "A great prophet has arisen in our midst, and God has visited his people." This report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding region. In Hebrew, interestingly enough, the root of the word for widow is alem, A-L-E-M, meaning unable to speak. So widows not only had lost their husband, but in some way had lost their voice, right? Because as women, without being attached to a man in that culture, that society, her rights, her very survival were undefended. Now she's lost her only son. You know, her social security. Was gone. So Jesus moved at this moment, as the gospel says, as Luke says, Jesus gave him to his mother, gave him back to his mother. What a fortunate mother this one was, because one thinks of all the mothers of only sons, only daughters, who have died and do not get their children back. But she was given, there's no explanation given why this one and not that one. But only life. Imagine their life together after this event. Imagine their conversations. Imagine their view of the world. Imagine their view of God. Life. The fullness of life. I think of my own parents, my own mother, whose only son, her firstborn son, died. As an infant in a car accident, 13 months old. What must that have been? I mean, again, our family has talked about that, but, and again, my mother, to her death, I mean, never fully, she never fully recovered from it. But they had another son, and then another son, and then another son. I'm sure there was some hope for a daughter along the way, but she had 3 more sons, and we had full lives. So after this crushing blow, after this cruelty in their lives, my parents lived resurrection, right? Couldn't explain it really, But where there was death, now there was life. And they did so through faith. I mean, they were people of deep faith, and not only faith, but deeply connected to their community, their parish community. And I'm sure could not have survived, would not have survived, or at least would not have known the life they knew, were it not for those reasons. So it is for us, right? Whatever our losses, and I think each of us might be able to point to something in our lives where we've, if not ourselves, have come back from the dead, that something around us has died. Perhaps that something is a someone around us has died. And we didn't know if we could go on, but yet here we stand. Here we are. Perhaps that loss is as recent as this week. Yet God in His goodness hangs on to us. Feels as if we're hanging on to God, but all along, of course, God is holding us. And we simply have to discover that or rediscover that. Perhaps that's a lesson for the times as well in which we find ourselves. So much loss. But pressing forward, we, out of faith, know that new life and better life will come of it, whether it's the social unrest, whether it's the COVID, how our lives have been turned upside down by COVID, and for those whose lives have been especially affected by COVID, those who've lost jobs, those who've lost homes, those who've lost, my God, those who've lost loved ones. Yet we go forward in hope. Jesus, for us widows, for those who are somehow have lost our voice or lost our security, Jesus gives us back our lives. That's all I have for today. Thank you for taking some time to reflect. May God be close to you in whatever way that you need to know resurrection, risen life today. God bless you.